Imagine waking up in the middle of winter and the water inside your home has frozen solid overnight. Not outside. Inside. The walls of your bedroom are covered in frost. Your breath forms thick clouds in the air. Your children are shivering so violently in the next room that you can hear their teeth chattering through the wall. The fire you built last night burned out hours ago, and now the temperature inside your home is barely different from the temperature outside, where it has dropped to levels that will kill an exposed person within hours. You have no central heating. No electric blankets. No insulated windows. No way to call for help. No store to run to for supplies. The wood you need for fuel belongs to the Lord who owns the land, and taking it without permission means losing your hand or your life. Your children are getting colder by the minute. Your youngest stopped shivering an hour ago, which means her body is giving up trying to fight the cold. And you are about to do something that would make every modern person watching this video recoil in horror. But you are going to do it anyway. Because it works. Because your grandmother did it, and her grandmother before her. Because in medieval Europe, staying warm in winter sometimes required doing things that seem absolutely terrifying by modern standards but were completely normal to people whose choice was simple. Do the unthinkable or watch your family freeze to death. Before we reveal the most terrifying things medieval people actually did to survive deadly winters, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of extreme historical survival fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will genuinely shock you and completely change how you understand what life in medieval Europe actually looked like when winter arrived. The cold that medieval Europeans faced wasn't the inconvenient chill that modern people complain about when the heating bill goes up. This was survival-level cold, life-threatening cold, the kind of cold that killed routinely and mercilessly every single winter across every level of society, from the poorest peasant in a mud hut to the wealthiest nobleman in a stone manor. Beginning around the 13th century, Europe entered what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of dramatically lower temperatures that lasted for centuries. Rivers that don't freeze today froze solid for months. The Baltic Sea froze over completely in some years. The Thames in London froze hard enough that people held entire winter fairs on its surface, with bonfires burning on the ice, market stalls selling food, and hundreds of people walking across what was normally a major river. In this cold, people died constantly. Every winter, across every region of medieval Europe, people froze to death in numbers that would make modern headlines for weeks. Entire villages were sometimes found dead. Travelers were discovered frozen on roads mere miles from towns. Infants died overnight in their cradles despite mothers doing everything possible to keep them warm. The elderly simply stopped waking up on the coldest mornings. And the methods people used to prevent this fate, the techniques they developed and practiced and passed down through generations of brutal winters, were often more shocking than the cold itself. The first terrifying method was one that almost nobody today knows about, and when researchers first found evidence of it in medieval records, many of them assumed the documents were mistaken. Medieval people, across every level of society from peasants to nobility, regularly slept with their animals. Not occasionally, in desperate situations. Routinely, as standard winter practice, as the expected and normal thing to do when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. In peasant households, this meant bringing cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats inside the main living space of the home. The animals weren't kept in separate rooms or barn areas. They were brought into the central living space where the family slept, ate, and conducted daily life. The entire family, parents, children, grandparents, everyone, would sleep in close proximity to their livestock. This seems horrifying by modern standards. The smell alone would be unbearable to contemporary sensibilities. The hygiene implications would make modern health officials weep. The physical danger of sharing a small enclosed space with large animals would seem obvious. But the thermal reality was undeniable. A single adult cow generates roughly the same heat output as a medium-sized electric space heater, operating continuously, requiring no fuel, producing warmth around the clock. A dozen animals in an enclosed space generated enough heat to raise the interior temperature by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius compared to outside. In conditions where outside temperatures dropped to -15 or -20 degrees Celsius, that difference wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. The difference between a room at -5 degrees and a room at 10 degrees, maintained by animal body heat, was the difference between dying and living. Medieval peasant homes were specifically designed to accommodate this practice. Archaeological excavations across northern Europe have found homes with what researchers call byre-dwellings, structures where the human living area and the animal area were either one continuous space or separated by only a low partition with no ceiling. The animal's body heat would rise and circulate through the entire structure. Human waste and animal waste combined on floors covered with straw that was replaced periodically but never kept clean by modern standards. The smell was extraordinary. The air quality was poor, and people survived winters that should have killed them. But even more shocking was what wealthier people did when the animals weren't enough and the cold became truly desperate. Medieval nobility had stone castles and manor houses that seemed substantial from outside but were thermal disasters in practice. Stone conducts cold with brutal efficiency. A stone wall in winter doesn't just fail to keep cold out, it actively radiates cold inward, making rooms colder than they would be in a simple wooden structure with the same fire. The wealthy had fireplaces, but medieval fireplaces were enormous and inefficient, sending most of their heat straight up the chimney while the rooms they supposedly heated remained cold enough to see breath. Tapestries on walls helped slightly, trapping a thin air layer between fabric and stone. Rushes on floors provided minimal insulation from freezing stone beneath. None of it was enough on the coldest nights. So the wealthy did something that reveals exactly how desperate the cold made even powerful people. They paid other human beings to warm their beds with their own bodies. This was a formal, documented practice with an actual job title. They were called bed warmers, or in some regions, warming servants, and their job was specific and consistent across different medieval cultures. Before a noble or wealthy person went to sleep, these servants would climb into the bed and lie there for 30 to 60 minutes, using their body heat to warm the mattress, the blankets, and the air trapped within the bed coverings. When the employer was ready to sleep, the servant would leave, and the noble would climb into a bed that was now warm from another person's body heat. The sheets that had been cold and damp from condensation were now dry and warm. The furs and blankets that had been cold were now heated through. This was not considered unusual or degrading by medieval standards. It was considered skilled domestic work. Good bed warmers were valued household employees. They had to be clean enough not to introduce parasites into the bedding, healthy enough not to transmit illness to their employers, and disciplined enough to leave the moment they were dismissed without complaint. The practice extended even further in some documented cases. In extremely cold periods, servants and lower-ranking household members would sleep in the same room as their employers, not in the bed but on pallets on the floor, specifically because multiple human bodies in an enclosed room raised the temperature enough to prevent the sleepers from dying of cold overnight. This mixing of social classes in sleeping spaces during extreme cold was accepted as necessity. A nobleman who woke up alive because his servants slept on the floor of his chamber had survived. A nobleman who insisted on privacy and found himself frozen in an empty room had not. But the terrifying winter survival methods went far beyond sleeping arrangements. Medieval people facing fuel shortages, which was common because forests were heavily controlled by nobles and the poor had limited legal access to firewood, burned things that modern people would consider absolutely unacceptable as fuel. They burned furniture, starting with chairs and tables, progressing to bed frames, and in the most desperate situations to the structural wooden elements of their own homes, beams and roof supports and flooring, essentially burning the structure they lived in to stay warm within it. Medieval records are full of accounts of people discovered in spring living in homes that had been partially dismantled from inside, beams missing from roofs, floor planks gone, interior walls stripped, all burned for winter warmth. The structural damage sometimes caused roofs to collapse, killing the inhabitants. Sometimes the roof held, and the people survived in a partially demolished structure that they would spend the following summer trying to repair before the next winter. They burned animal dung, not occasionally as a fuel supplement but systematically, as a primary fuel source in regions where wood was scarce. Dried cattle, sheep, and horse dung burns surprisingly well and produces significant heat. Medieval peasants would collect every piece of animal waste from the previous summer, dry it carefully, and store it as winter fuel. The smell when burning was significant. The air quality in homes heated with burning dung was genuinely toxic by modern standards. Respiratory disease was endemic in medieval communities partly because of the constant smoke and combustion products from burning every available organic material. They burned peat, which was more available than wood in many regions and became a primary fuel across Ireland, Scotland, parts of Scandinavia, and Northern Europe. Peat harvesting consumed enormous amounts of summer labor because enough peat had to be cut, dried, and stored to last through winter. Communities that fell short of their peat stores faced the same desperate choices as those who ran out of firewood. What very few history books mention is that medieval people also burned bone. After animals were slaughtered for winter food, every bone was saved. Bones were boiled for broth, the marrow extracted for nutrition, and then the bones were dried and burned. Bone fuel burns hot and produces little smoke compared to wood, which made it surprisingly valuable. The smell of burning bone is distinctive and unpleasant, but medieval people burned it without hesitation because cold didn't care about unpleasant smells. In the most desperate circumstances, medieval peasants burned everything they had accumulated and valued. Historical records from particularly brutal winters, like the winter of 1315 during the Great Famine, describe people burning their seed grain to stay warm, destroying the very material they needed to plant crops in spring and ensure food for the following year. This decision represented the ultimate desperate calculation. Burn the seed grain and survive the winter but face potential starvation the following year. Don't burn it and potentially die from cold before spring ever arrived. Many chose warmth and faced the consequences later. Some survived both the winter and the following hungry summer. Others didn't. But fuel burning, as terrifying as the extremes were, wasn't the most shocking method medieval people used. The clothing practices that medieval people adopted for extreme winter survival would horrify modern observers for entirely different reasons. Medieval people did not change their clothes in winter. Not for weeks. Not for months. The innermost layer of clothing, the shirt or chemise worn directly against the skin, might not be removed from late autumn until spring. People slept in their clothes, worked in their clothes, ate in their clothes, and wore those same clothes day after day until the temperature rose enough that changing became possible without the risk of exposing the body to killing cold during the vulnerability of being undressed. The insect infestations that resulted were significant and accepted. Lice were universal in medieval populations partly because the cold made regular changes of clothing impossible for most people. Medieval accounts of winter describe the constant itching from parasites as simply part of the season, as normal and expected as the cold itself. The smell that accumulated in unwashed clothing worn continuously for months was extreme by any standard. But medieval people existed in a context where everyone smelled this way, where perfumes and strong scents were used by the wealthy to mask rather than eliminate body odors, and where the alternative to smelling was being naked and dead. Multiple layers of these unwashed clothes were worn simultaneously in the coldest periods. A medieval peasant might wear 3 or 4 shirts layered on top of each other, each layer trapping air and adding insulation even as each additional layer added to the accumulated grime and parasite population. The layering technique itself was genuine thermal wisdom. Trapped air between layers insulates better than any single thick garment. Medieval people had figured this out through experience, though they didn't understand the physics. They knew that more layers meant warmer, and in temperatures that killed, warmer meant alive. What they also knew was that getting wet was potentially fatal. Wet clothing loses almost all insulating value because water conducts heat away from the body far faster than air. Medieval people in winter avoided water with what seems like paranoid intensity to modern observers, but was actually rational survival behavior. They did not bathe in winter. This wasn't purely about cleanliness standards or lack of soap. It was thermal survival strategy. The process of undressing, entering water, even heated water, then dressing again in cold air created dangerous exposure that could trigger hypothermia in weakened, cold-stressed bodies. Medieval records document that even the wealthy, who had access to heated bathing chambers, reduced bathing dramatically in winter. The poor stopped entirely from first frost until late spring thaw. Months without any bathing, sleeping in accumulated clothing, sharing spaces with animals, all of it accepted and normal because cold killed faster than any infection from poor hygiene. The clothing practices and fuel burning were terrifying enough. But medieval people went further. Much further. The things they did with food, with their children, with their bodies, and with each other to survive the deadliest winter nights reveal a level of desperation that modern people living in heated homes with full refrigerators simply cannot comprehend. Medieval people understood something about the human body that modern people have largely forgotten because we no longer need to think about it. Food is fuel, and fuel generates heat. The body burns calories to maintain temperature, and in extreme cold it burns them at dramatically accelerated rates. A person doing moderate activity in freezing temperatures burns 2 to 3 times the calories they'd burn in a warm environment. A person doing hard physical labor in extreme cold might burn 4 or 5 times their normal caloric requirement. Medieval people couldn't articulate the metabolic science, but they knew the result from direct observation. People who ate enough fat and protein before sleeping in cold conditions survived the night better than people who went to bed hungry. Children who received adequate food in winter stayed alive longer than children who didn't. The connection between eating and surviving cold was undeniable and well understood. So in winter, medieval people ate things they would never touch in warmer months. The diet shifted radically toward the most calorie-dense, fat-rich foods available regardless of taste or what modern people would consider palatability. They rendered fat from every available animal source and consumed it directly. Not as cooking oil or as flavor added to other foods. Pure rendered animal fat eaten by the spoonful, consumed deliberately as fuel for the body's internal furnace. Beef tallow, pork lard, mutton fat, the fat stripped from game animals, all of it was saved, rendered, stored in clay pots, and rationed through winter as a survival resource as important as firewood. The taste was exactly what you'd imagine. Eating cold rendered animal fat with no seasoning, no bread to spread it on, no other food to disguise it, was unpleasant enough that modern people would gag. Medieval people ate it without complaint because they understood clearly that eating this fat meant their body had fuel to generate heat through the night, and not eating it meant waking up colder, weaker, and more vulnerable to the cold that was trying to kill them. They ate organs that modern Western consumers throw away. Hearts, lungs, kidneys, livers, intestines, brain, every internal organ of slaughtered animals was consumed because organs are dense in calories, protein, and fat. Nothing was wasted. The parts of animals that wealthy modern consumers pay premium prices to avoid were the most valued winter foods in medieval Europe because they provided concentrated nutrition that sustained body temperature. Blood was consumed directly. When animals were slaughtered, the blood was caught, mixed with grain or fat, cooked into blood puddings and sausages, or simply boiled and consumed as a thick liquid. Blood is rich in protein and iron. Medieval people who consumed it regularly were better nourished than those who didn't, and better nourished bodies generated more heat and survived cold better. The timing of eating was as important as what was eaten. Medieval people learned to eat their largest, most calorie-dense meal immediately before sleeping, specifically to ensure their bodies had maximum fuel available during the long cold hours of the night when no active movement was generating additional warmth. The last meal of the day in winter was the most important meal, and it was designed for one purpose: keeping the body warm enough to survive until morning. Thick soups heavy with fat and meat, dense grain porridges cooked with animal fat, any remaining fresh food combined into the most calorie-rich mixture possible. People ate until they were uncomfortably full because the excess calories they consumed would burn slowly through the night, maintaining core body temperature in sleeping bodies that couldn't generate the additional heat that movement provided. For children, this food prioritization revealed some of the most heartbreaking and terrifying aspects of medieval winter survival. Children, especially infants and toddlers, were far more vulnerable to cold than adults. Their bodies had less mass, less insulating fat, higher surface area relative to volume, and less developed thermoregulation. A temperature that made an adult uncomfortable would kill a small child. Medieval parents did things to protect their children from cold that modern child protection services would investigate immediately. They kept children in what can only be described as near-complete immobility during the coldest periods, wrapping infants so tightly in cloth and furs that the children couldn't move their limbs. This wasn't gentle swaddling. This was binding that restricted movement almost entirely for hours at a time. The thermal logic was sound. Movement generates heat, yes, but movement also exposes surface area to cold air and burns calories at rates that small bodies couldn't sustain through food intake alone. An immobile, tightly wrapped child burned fewer calories, lost less heat to the air, and maintained body temperature better than a moving child whose coverings would inevitably shift and expose skin. Medieval parents also kept children in the warmest spot in the home continuously, regardless of what other activities required. The space closest to the fire, the spot with the most concentrated warmth, belonged to the youngest and most vulnerable children during winter. Adults would work in colder parts of the room, sleep in less desirable positions, deny themselves warmth they needed, to ensure children stayed in the thermal safe zone. When fires burned low overnight and the household temperature dropped dangerously, parents would press children against their own bodies, using adult body heat to maintain the child's temperature. Multiple children would be sandwiched between adults, surrounded by bodies warmer than the air around them. Families that should have slept separately by modern social standards slept in tight clusters specifically because every body in the cluster contributed warmth that kept the weakest members alive. The practice of multiple people sharing body heat went beyond immediate family in the most desperate situations. Historical records from severely cold winters document communities where neighbors who might not normally socialize closely would move into a single structure together, combining body heat, combining fuel supplies, combining food stores, specifically to survive temperatures that would have killed households living separately. Medieval villages during extreme cold events sometimes essentially merged into single communal living situations for the duration of the worst weather. 10 or 15 people in a space designed for 5 or 6, sleeping in layers on every available surface, generating collective warmth that no individual household could match alone. This communal survival strategy required abandoning privacy, personal space, and the normal social distances that defined medieval community relationships. People who were rivals, people who didn't like each other, people separated by social rank, all of it was suspended when cold became severe enough. The physical reality of warmth mattered more than any social convention. What happened in these communal survival situations, the intimacy forced by extreme cold, the breaking down of normal social barriers, these are documented in medieval records with a frankness that surprises modern readers. People slept pressed against other people they would never normally touch. Social distinctions that governed every other aspect of medieval life dissolved when the alternative was freezing. Medieval people also did things to their homes during extreme cold that seem like deliberate self-destruction but were calculated survival choices. They blocked every possible air gap with any available material. Mud, wet clay, torn clothing, animal dung, moss, grass, anything that could be pressed into cracks in walls, gaps around doors, spaces where cold air was infiltrating. The deliberate sealing of homes created serious air quality problems because the same gaps that allowed cold in also allowed combustion gases out. A completely sealed home with a burning fire would accumulate carbon monoxide and other combustion products to dangerous levels. Medieval people died from this. Medieval records include accounts of entire families found dead in winter with no apparent cause, which historians and medical experts now recognize as likely carbon monoxide poisoning from sealed homes with burning fires. Yet the practice of sealing continued because the immediate threat of cold was more obvious and more terrifying than the invisible threat of combustion gases. People felt the cold. They couldn't feel the carbon monoxide. The choice to seal and risk gas poisoning versus leave gaps and risk certain freezing made brutal sense in the moment, even when it killed some families. The windows in medieval homes, where windows existed at all, were covered in winter with materials that reveal how desperate insulation attempts became. Glass was expensive and rare, available only to wealthy households. Most medieval homes had window openings covered with oiled cloth, oiled parchment, or stretched animal membrane that let in some light while providing minimal cold protection. In the coldest periods, even these minimal light sources were sacrificed. Window openings were stuffed with straw, packed with dried moss, filled with whatever insulating material was available, and sealed completely. Medieval households in the depths of winter lived in complete darkness during daylight hours, sacrificing the psychological comfort of light for the thermal benefit of sealed walls. Life conducted entirely by firelight in sealed, dark, smoke-filled spaces for months at a time created psychological effects that medieval people acknowledged and struggled with. The records from monasteries, where literate monks documented their experiences, describe the oppressive darkness of winter in sealed buildings, the depression that accumulated through months without natural light, the desperate relief when temperatures finally rose enough to unseal windows. Ordinary peasants who couldn't write left no such records, but the physical evidence from their homes tells the same story. These were spaces designed for survival at the cost of almost everything else that made life comfortable or pleasant. The communal bathing practices that developed in medieval towns and cities also reflected winter survival logic in ways that seem paradoxical. Public bathhouses, which existed in medieval towns and were regularly used during warmer months, became survival facilities in winter. Not for hygiene but for warmth. Medieval townspeople would pay to spend time in bathhouses specifically because the heated water and steam created warm environments that allowed bodies to recover from the accumulated cold stress of days or weeks in inadequately heated homes. The bathhouse visit wasn't about getting clean. It was about getting warm, about allowing the body's core temperature to fully recover, about surviving the winter by supplementing the inadequate heating of home environments with periodic access to genuine warmth. The bathhouse operators charged accordingly, and in severe winters, the price could be extractive because demand was desperate. People paid what they had to pay because the alternative was continuing to live in cold that was slowly weakening their bodies and would eventually kill them. Medieval people also used the bodies of recently dead animals in ways that seem grotesque to modern sensibilities but made perfect thermal sense. When an animal died, from cold, from disease, from any cause, the body retained heat for hours. Medieval people would press against freshly dead animals, wrap themselves in the warm carcass, allow the residual heat from a dead cow or horse to warm them in ways that no other readily available source could match. This was particularly documented in accounts of travelers caught in winter storms who survived by cutting open dead animals and sheltering inside the carcass, using the retained body heat and physical shelter of the dead animal to survive until conditions improved. The practice appears in multiple independent historical sources from different regions and centuries, suggesting it was widely known and practiced. Medieval people who worked with animals also developed specific relationships with living animals during winter that went beyond the barn sharing already described. Wealthy households kept small dogs specifically as portable heat sources. These weren't companion animals in the modern sense. They were thermal tools. Small dogs with dense fur were placed in beds at the feet of sleepers, tucked under blankets, held against bodies during the coldest nights, essentially used as living hot water bottles. The term, three-dog night, meaning a night so cold that you needed 3 dogs to keep warm, comes directly from this practice. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal description of calibrating the number of dogs needed, based on how cold the night was expected to be. Larger dogs served in similar capacities for poorer households that couldn't afford the fuel to maintain fires through the night. A large dog sleeping pressed against a human body provided significant warmth. Multiple dogs piled together with humans created a communal thermal mass that could maintain survivable temperatures in unheated spaces. Medieval monasteries, which kept detailed records that have survived, documented the use of dogs in dormitories during winter with complete matter-of-factness. The monks weren't embarrassed by the practice. They noted it the way they noted other practical arrangements, as a sensible response to a real problem. Dogs kept the monks warm enough to sleep. Monks who slept warmly enough could wake for the required prayer hours without dying of cold exposure during night services in unheated chapels. The chapel problem reveals another terrifying aspect of medieval winter survival: the conflict between religious obligation and physical survival. Medieval Christians were required to attend religious services that were held in stone churches and chapels that were never heated. In winter, these buildings were colder than the already cold homes people came from. Medieval church records document the deaths of congregants from cold during or immediately after services. They document the practice of clergy conducting services as rapidly as possible during extreme cold to minimize exposure time. They document dispensations from attendants given to the elderly and very young when temperatures were life-threatening. They also document something that reveals how desperate people became: the gathering of large numbers of people in churches not for services but for warmth, specifically because the body heat of hundreds of people in an enclosed stone space raised the temperature enough to provide relief. The church as warming center, people sitting pressed together in pews not in prayer but in survival mode, using the stone building and the collective human warmth of the congregation to recover from cold that was damaging their bodies in their homes. Medieval people also consumed alcohol in winter in quantities and contexts that would be considered extreme today, specifically for its warming effect. The sensation of warmth that alcohol produces is partly illusory, caused by blood vessels dilating near the skin surface, but the caloric content of ale, mead, and wine was real and provided fuel for metabolic heat generation. Medieval winter ale was deliberately brewed to be higher in calories than summer ale, thicker and more nutritious, designed to serve as both drink and food supplement. It was consumed multiple times daily by people of all ages including children because in the context of winter survival, the caloric content mattered more than modern concerns about alcohol and children. The most terrifying aspect of all these practices isn't how extreme they were. It's how rational they were. Medieval people doing these things weren't being reckless or primitive. They were making calculated decisions based on accurate understanding of what kept human bodies alive in killing cold. They knew that body heat from animals worked. They knew that calorie-dense food before sleep helped survival. They knew that multiple bodies together stayed warmer than single bodies alone. They knew that sealed spaces retained more heat than drafty ones. They knew that every layer of clothing mattered and every source of warmth had to be used. They knew these things because they'd learned them through generations of winters where the wrong choices meant dead family members. The terror of their methods reflects the terror of their situation. Cold that killed, cold that came every year, cold that didn't care about dignity or comfort or modern sensibilities. What they built from that desperate knowledge was a survival system that kept medieval European populations alive through centuries of winters that should have been impossible to survive with the technology they had. The terrifying methods worked. The populations that practiced them endured. The knowledge passed from generation to generation, until eventually technology changed enough that the extreme measures became unnecessary. But for centuries, this was simply what winter meant. Not inconvenience. Not cold weather gear and heated cars. Survival calculations made fresh every night, with human bodies and animal warmth and every available calorie standing between medieval families and the cold that wanted to kill them.